Good day to one and all, and welcome to today's talk on the debates in the recent historiography of the concepts, quote, Platonic Orientalism and Western Esotericism. Now, on account of length, I've been forced to break this up into two talks, the first being largely concerned with setting up the backdrop for the debates and explaining the concept of Platonic Orientalism, which feeds into Western Esotericism, and then the second talk being concerned with the actual debates in the scholarly literature using direct block quotations by and large. Okay, so historiography. Now, right off the bat, what does that mean? Historiography is the history of history. That is to say, the history of how our historical narratives come into being. Who are the historians writing our history? What are the conditions in their lives which produce such work as theirs? Well, the plan is to bring this idea down to bear upon quote-unquote Western Esotericism. And this is exactly where it starts to get complicated, because Western Esotericism is not a reified thing in and of itself. It's not even exactly a clear idea. Nevertheless, the reason you're probably all here listening to me is because you have some understanding or another of what this nebulous esotericism thing, let alone Western esotericism, actually is. Now, I'm not even going to try and define it here, because that's what we're going to be covering in this mini-series. That is, the history of an umbrella term that has no historical essence in and of itself, like a greater whole made up the sum of its disparate lesser parts. Now, this debate largely hinges around the work of Wouter Hanegraaff, Esotericism in the Academy, and all of the debates surrounding that book as raised by his various colleagues throughout Europe, that is, fellow scholars of Hermetic and or other related subjects. If you're not going to go out and read this book, Esotericism in the Academy, or read all of the reviews which have been collated in the journal Religion, I'll provide a bibliography in the notes, then probably your best bet to get some context is to mosey on over to the Rittman Library's YouTube page and watch all of Wouter Hanegraaff's Infinite Fire webinar in 3 parts. This should give you a good grasp of some of the concepts we're going to discuss here, but I'm going to do my best to reiterate most of the ideas discussed there as they become important to our talk. I'm going to lay my cards out on the table right away. This talk is largely going to be made up of ideas presented by Hanegraaff himself, and the next talk is going to feature a lot of citations from other scholars criticizing him and his response. So I will do my due diligence to cite them all carefully and present their arguments in an organized manner, preferably in their own words so as to not create straw men. And again, I'll have a bibliography in the notes if you want to check out these debates for yourself. I'm not even going to be discussing the book Esotericism in the Academy very much, so much as the debates around what esotericism even means. I think probably the best place to start, and where Wouter Hanegraaff himself would probably start, is with a few words on Platonic Orientalism. Understanding the various paths which Platonism took in late antiquity is crucial for grasping the colorful array of belief systems involved in what is now labeled Western Esotericism, namely, quote, a distinct form of spirituality extending from Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and Gnosticism in the early Christian era up until the present, end quote. Now, this handful of esoteric currents was diffused throughout the Arab and Byzantine cultures throughout the Middle Ages before experiencing a kind of revival. This revival occurred through the Florentine Neoplatonists of the late 15th century. From the 16th century onwards, esoteric or unorthodox spirituality was carried out by Renaissance astrologers, alchemists and magicians, Christian Kabbalists, Theosophists, Rosicrucians, Freemasons, and natural philosophers, well until the modern Victorian era occult revival, in which post-colonial syncretism and the theosophy of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky played a key role. Alongside this Western tradition, or perhaps inextricably bound up with it, were the Arabic and Jewish traditions as well. Astrology, alchemy, natural philosophy, etc. These entered, quote-unquote, the West through southern Italy and Spain, starting around the 10th century onwards, culminating in the latter half of the 15th century. Note, something that I think is actually worth mentioning before moving on, and that is when scholars use the word occult. It is strictly referring to 19th century occultism. The Donnellys, the Blavatskys, the Besants, etc. It's not a synonym for esotericism as a whole. Now, in light of this gloss, you should realize that Platonic Orientalism is an extremely loaded term, and I will do my best to explain what it means and why it has any value. Ultimately, Platonic Orientalism is a historiographical concept, not a historical reality. It's a concept which delineates the study of reception, and that is the reception of a reception of a reception. What I mean by that is that it is a concept which encapsulates within itself all discourse, all the chatter, which you should all be very familiar with, surrounding the idea that there was a quote-unquote ancient wisdom tradition, which had allegedly come from the Orient, was synthesized by Plato, re-exported into the lands conquered by Alexander the Great, then were re-received, if you will. Now, before you freak out, know that nobody is claiming whether this is true or not. There are hundreds of different theories as to who Plato or Pythagoras jacked their ideas from, and they're all interesting, but they're not going to be discussed here. What matters is what people believed throughout history, particularly during the Renaissance and in the Florentine Academy. So, I'll explore this concept in a lot more detail. This idea that the so-called mysticism of the Orient was reformulated by Plato, whose impact on history was just as much as a religious thinker like Buddha or Christ as it was as some kind of rationalist logician. In Hanegraaff's words, there are two competing strains in philosophy, the rational and the mystical. And the mystical is academically homeless. The rational, however, is center stage. Now, what complicates the term Platonic Orientalism even more so is that everyone immediately thinks of Edward Said's book on post-colonial literary criticism called Orientalism. And that's all fine and good because there are many interesting concepts in that book, but ultimately, Platonic Orientalism has little to do with Said's theories, which postulate that the West understands itself against its own imagined image of a kind of monolithic East. So, in other words, Western society constructs its identity against the backdrop of concepts like Eastern decadence, tyranny, barbarism, lustiness, wealth, and so forth. So, corresponding to these, we have classic Western values like frugality and freedom and civilization and restraint and these sorts of concepts. Now, there's much more to this idea, and over the past few decades, it's spawned an entire lens through which we can break down literature. I remember I was at a medieval conference, and there was a session being held there that was literally called Fuck Orientalism. This gave me a good laugh because I totally understand why some medievalists might not care about post-colonial theory, or any postmodern theory for that matter. But in any case, Said's idea of Orientalism, according to Hanegraaff, is but a mere chapter in a larger story. Now, the term Platonic Orientalism wasn't coined by Hanegraaff himself. It was a specialist of medieval Islamic mysticism, Joan Walbridge, who came up with the term in his exploration of Suhrawardi, a Persian philosopher who fused Zoroastrian and Platonic thought. Now, what Hanegraaff argues is that and this is a key component in his argument, as we'll come to see, is that the idea of Platonic Orientalism, maybe not in those words, but as an ongoing historiographical concept, was actually a widespread idea in antiquity, particularly in late antiquity. And this idea consists of two elements. The first being, again, that Plato was not a philosophe in the modern sense of the word, a kind of like European Enlightenment, anti-pre-Socratic figure focused on rational knowledge. No, Plato was more so important in his role as a religious thinker, someone who teaches a kind of wisdom tradition with religious import. Now, obviously, in the pre-modern world, religion and philosophy are inseparable. And so it's only through modern post-Enlightenment categories that we have to even think this way about Plato. That is, that a mystical thinker is somehow antithetical to a mathematical or scientific thinker. So this is one of the reasons why Hanegraaff is endorsing the Platonic Orientalism idea. Because many philosophers in antiquity understood Plato in this way. Now, the second part of this, and this is just as vital as the first, is that Plato was not the originator of this wisdom tradition that he taught. No, this was the sum of Oriental wisdom, which had been gathered by traveling philosophers, priests, Brahmin, and magi, and, whether the Greeks went and got it, or whether the ideas came to them, they passed on through the ages, and they finally reached Plato, who merely understood the concepts clearly enough to explain them in terms his fellow Greeks would understand. So again, whether this is actually true or not is not what matters. You can go full skeptic and say that everything that ever happened in the world was an independent development, or you can go full Blavatsky and think that the secret doctrine was received in its perfect form in India, and the further you go from there, the more degraded the wisdom tradition got. It's all entirely debatable. And there are as many theories as there are thinkers on the subject. No, what matters is that people believed it was true. Now, I'll go on a little digression here because I think it's important. The rate of change in our world is astounding. The world I see out my window is not the world I saw out my window 5 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. It's very easy for us to see this relentless change and think that progress is some kind of unseen force tugging on the strings of history, and that things somehow naturally will get better with time. And even then, the sky isn't the limit. Now, in ancient times, things moved much more slowly. In fact, things moved so slowly that it was hard to conceive of an idea like progress at all. The continuity just outweighed the change, even enough to offset the bias we have towards change because it's exciting. Now, what this did was it made people look to the antiquity of a thing for its legitimacy rather than its novelty. The idea was that at some point in time there was a golden age where men and gods practically lived together and communed in divine wisdom in some sort of Edenic paradise, and from that point on things just got worse and worse, degrading by degree until we reach the most barbarous age, the Kali Yuga, or the Age of Iron that we live in now, something like this. Romanticizing the past is a way people project their alienation from the world. At least that was the case for most people back then. Today we project our alienation, our hopes and fears, into the future, into all manner of science fiction scenarios or utopian visions of a perfect society. Now, why I'm saying this is because until the Enlightenment, it was this former model which reigned supreme. The older a thing was, the better it was. The truer, the purer, the more pristine. So now, even if Plato made up everything he wrote on his own, which he definitely didn't, it would be in his best interest to link himself to an ancient tradition and try to get some of that legitimizing mana for his own system. We today have things very differently. We're capitalists, so we like patents and we like intellectual property. We're always after the latest updates, the latest textbooks, the latest everything, in hopes that the errors of the past have been ironed out. Well, obviously, anybody who's ever loved classic cars, vintage amps, or Windows XP knows that newer doesn't mean better, and that they just don't make things the way they used to. In any case, this will become important again. So, moving on and fast forward about 6 or 7 centuries, and what we have is this Orientalized Platonic wisdom tradition being assimilated by Christianity. They are stripping away all the wheat from the works of the pagan philosophers and separating them from the chaff. That is, everything that supports the narrative of Christian theology can stay, while the rest is to be relegated to the trash bin. So here we have the Church Fathers trying to reconcile the words of Jesus, St. Paul, these figures, with Platonic concepts, and surprisingly, things fit rather nicely. Remember that the quote-unquote books of the Platonists are what set Augustine on his philosophical journey toward Christianity. Platonic Orientalism thus becomes a part of Christianity. It is absorbed, if you will, particularly in the Greek-speaking East. Throughout the Middle Ages, the only thing the West had of Plato was the Timaeus, his most comprehensive and also his most mystical work. Now, Christians were faced with a huge intellectual problem in light of what I mentioned concerning the proportional relationship between the legitimacy and the antiquity of an idea. If you wanted your beliefs to hold any authority, you had to prove that they were somehow part of an unbroken chain of wisdom that was very, very old. Since the Christian Church Fathers understood this, Many of them having been pagans themselves earlier on in their lives, they were always reaching further and further back for older sources to legitimize the new religion. Of course, the Neoplatonists and the scribe priests of Hellenistic Egypt held that the oldest source was Hermes Trismegistus. The Pythagoreans revered Orpheus, while others said that the Zoroaster was at the root of all ancient wisdom. But of course, the church fathers ultimately said, no, Moses is at the root of this whole intellectual tradition. At Sinai, there were two revelations, one written in stone and one written in Moses' heart. Later, in the Middle Ages, this quote-unquote tradition, or reception, would acquire the name Kabbalah. It's a bit too soon to speak of that here with the Church Fathers, though mysticism and wisdom literature had, of course, been a well-known aspect of post-Second Temple Judaism. Now, Lactantius is a good example of a Christian who interacted with pagan sources. He even mentioned Hermes Trismegistus, and in no mean terms either. This, of course, was not universal, since many of the Church Fathers rejected all pagan wisdom. Hence the rhetorical question, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? I'd like to think it's sort of like smoking. You never find people who are more against smoking than ex-smokers. And in the same way, you'll never find people who are more against pagan ideas coexisting with Christianity than former pagans. Obviously, it's because they love it and they're scared, but I'm not going to go there. Now, why do we even need an idea like this Platonic Orientalism? Here's where it gets a bit murkier. And actually, this implicates yours truly for similar reasons. Platonic Orientalism is the term Hanegraaff wants to use as a kind of intellectual cudgel to beat the life out of Dame Frances Yates' grand narrative of a quote-unquote Hermetic tradition. So, what's being referred to here is the idea, as put forward by Frances Yates in her wildly popular Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, that modern science emerged out of medieval Renaissance magic, and that Hermeticism was the tradition which coaxed this out, or at least facilitated this process. I should mention that this whole talk, everything we talk about today, implicates Terence McKenna as well, since he absolutely loved the Yates narrative and made it a cornerstone of his speaking tours. I think the role Terence had on popularizing Yates is wildly underplayed, but that's another story. Now, Frances Yates, back in the year 1964, tried to put Hermeticism at the root of modern Western science. That was her a priori assumption. And so she tried to force a narrative around that idea by cherry-picking a bunch of big names from the Renaissance, telling us a bunch of stuff about them, and then labeling them all Hermeticists, where the word esotericism, or you guessed it, Platonic Orientalism, would have been clearer and more honest. Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno, none of these people identified as Hermeticists, so why even use the label? Now, what needs to be admitted is that since Yates and her, let's call it a noble lie, maybe that's a little strong, but since her work, intellectual historians of science and philosophy, etc., have finally begun to give honest attention to the pre-modern sciences of alchemy, astrology, etc. Before Yates, these were just superstitious follies, and spending any time on the history of these subjects was a waste of time. After Yates, these were legitimate objects of historical inquiry. Now, despite this, Hanegraaff thinks it's far too much of a stretch to say science emerged directly from the Hermetic tradition. And this is, quote, Yates's great exaggeration. She was not trying to understand Hermeticism on its own terms. She was studying it as a means to an end. Modern science. In her mind, Hermeticism was synonymous with, quote-unquote, magic. And therefore she placed magic at the root of science. Now, in 1964, this was highly controversial, but it got a lot of attention from the popular reader, and once it got into their hands, defining Hermeticism got out of hand. Modern science could be said to have emerged in some sense from the musings of astrologers and the tinkering of alchemists, but to what extent are these magicians, in the sense of the Renaissance magus, the one who reads Picatrix and Asclepius and calls down planetary spirits from images and reveres the wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus? It boils down to a case-by-case basis. Cornelius Agrippa, he was definitely one of these people. But Marsilio Ficino, a Platonist, Pico della Mirandola, a Christian Kabbalist, were not. Incidentally, Yates completely ignores and leaves out one of the real Hermeticists, that is, the Christian poet Ludovico Lazzarelli. This guy didn't fit into Yates's grand narrative because he was too minor. He was too obscure to hinge a grand narrative off of. And most importantly, he didn't care about science or magic. So he really didn't fit the part for the play that she was writing. The problem is this, as Hanegraaff argues, and I think he's missing the Picatrix from his picture, whereas Yates doesn't, but we'll ignore that here since it doesn't change too much. The whole magical tradition of the Renaissance derives from one Hermetic work which survived in the Latin West called the Asclepius. Now, the Corpus Hermeticum itself was totally unknown to the Latin West until its rediscovery during the Renaissance. Now, Francis Yates quotes the Poimandres of the Corpus Hermeticum about 30 times. But the rest of it she barely quotes ever. And then she also cites the Asclepius 110 times. In short, the Hermetic style magic seen in the Asclepius was not new to the 15th century. What was new was the Corpus Hermeticum. And this was, according to Hanegraaff, not magic. The bits that are magic are from the Asclepius. And this was already known in the Middle Ages. So what it ultimately means then is that there is no Renaissance Hermetic tradition as envisioned by Francis Yates. The real Hermetic tradition was, rather, Hanegraaff tells us, Platonic Orientalism. Now, of course, there are problems here. This begs the question, how do you define magic if, say, the Poimandres is not magical? And doubtless Hanegraaff has dealt with this elsewhere in his voluminous works, but to me, personally, magic doesn't necessarily have to be a practical, hands-on thing. I think a book describing gnosis or mystical revelation in some kind of initiatory mode qualifies as magic. But anyhow, what's important is that we need to conceptualize Hermeticism as a historical reality because Yates has entirely hijacked the narrative. Alright, so in place of the Hermetic tradition, Hanegraaff offers us Platonic Orientalism. And what I'd like to do is to imagine this as like a jewel with many facets, or perhaps a rope with many strands. Ultimately, there are three main facets or strands, and then further subvariations thereof. Number one, there is a Mosaic strand. Number two, there is a Zoroastrian strand. And number three, there is a Hermetic strand, each of which were reinterpreted through the lens of Hellenistic Platonism. And remember, whether this was real or merely perceived is another issue. Now, in the Renaissance, what was understood to have happened is that early Christianity had adopted the Orientalized Platonic tradition by drawing from the Mosaic strand. Marsilio Ficino came up with this concept of a prisca theologica, that is, a pristine form of universal, all-encompassing ancient wisdom. And that this had to have come to someone first. It had to come to someone before it was taught to subsequent generations of sages via initiation. This prisca theologica is what many people today call, albeit problematically, Hermeticism. And this is in large part thanks to Yates. The problem is that Hermes was just one of the many ancient sages competing for primacy in the chain of this wisdom tradition. It isn't a given that everyone believed Hermes Trismegistus to be the source of all wisdom. So let's unpack this further. It's been argued that Marsilio Ficino, who was translating the complete works of Plato for Cosimo de' Medici, had to interrupt his work to translate the Corpus Hermeticum when it came over to Italy from Greece. Now, the way the Yates narrative goes, she makes it seem like the reason he interrupted the translations of Plato for Hermes was purely because Hermes Trismegistus was believed to be older and therefore more authoritative. The problem is, however, that this narrative overlooks the more pragmatic aspect of why this was done. The fact was simply that the Corpus Hermeticum was much shorter than the works of Plato, so it could be finished as just a kind of brief detour. Nevertheless, Ficino finishes his translation in 1473. Now, years before this, in 1464, during the translation process, and in large part thanks to Gemistus Plato, who I'll discuss in a moment, Ficino had a change of heart. What was this change of heart? Well, after doing a bunch of scholarship, Ficino changed his mind about where the Prisca Theologica came from and who was its source. He no longer believed Hermes to be the oldest in the wisdom tradition chain. No, rather he thinks, like Gemistus Plato, that all the wisdom contained in the Corpus Hermeticum, in the Bible, and in Plato, that these can all be reliably traced back to the prophetic teachings of the Zoroaster, or Zarathustra. This had been the position held by the Byzantine crypto-Christian and Neoplatonic scholar par excellence, Georgius Gemistus, who later called himself Platon, or Plato, that is, Plato. This sage single-handedly was responsible for saving Plato's thoughts from certain destruction at the hands of the Ottoman Turks, and reintroducing them into the West during the 1438 to 1439 Council of Florence, which had been a kind of failed attempt to reconcile the East-West schism before the fall of Constantinople in 1453. It was here that old man Pletho, now 80 years old, met and influenced a very young Cosimo de' Medici. He influenced him to found a new Platonic academy, which, under Marsilio Ficino, would be responsible for the translation of Plato's texts into Latin. This also included the Aeneads of Plotinus, various other Neoplatonic works, and texts like the Chaldean Oracles. Now, it's these Chaldean Oracles which convinced both Pletho and Ficino that the Zoroaster was at the root of all ancient wisdom, which, by the way, like the Corpus Hermeticum, these oracular texts are not as ancient as they were believed to be. It's just that the latent Orientalism of the Western mind lends antiquity, mystery, and authority to a thing merely by virtue of it coming from the East. They believed the Chaldean oracles to be the oldest text, and they saw in them the same glimmers of wisdom which they had gleaned from Plato. So naturally, they assumed these to have been crucial in influencing Plato, when, in fact, it was the other way around. They, like the Corpus Hermeticum, are 2nd century AD texts, replete with the syncretism of contemporary Gnostic ideas. In the Renaissance, of course, they did not know that yet. Now, this obviously poses a problem. Remember that old Pletho isn't really a Christian, so he doesn't actually have a dog in the fight. Ficino, however, does. This poses a problem, because what it means is that if there is only one source of Prisca Theologica, or ancient wisdom, then that means that the revelations of Moses are subordinate to those of a pagan. Meaning that he couldn't have got them from God except as some kind of parallel or independent revelation. Well, this here was one of the big debates of the Renaissance. Whether the foundations of Christian doctrine were indeed rooted in the dualistic revelations of a swarthy pagan like the Zoroaster, or some ibis-headed sorcerer like Hermes Trismegistus, or if, after all, they were really rooted in the visions of Moses, who, let's not forget, was raised and educated in Egypt, and was believed to have been initiated in both the mysteries of the old gods and those of Jethro, the Midianites' god. Now, for some thinkers, Lazzarelli, Agrippa, etc., it didn't matter that Christianity emerged out of pagan wisdom. What was true wisdom regardless of who said it. All that mattered was whether or not it could, in the end, be reconciled with the teachings in both the Old and the New Testament. The idea was that pagan wisdom was, quote-unquote, fulfilled through the person and sacrifice of Christ. So, for example, to Ludovico Lazzarelli, the Poimander of Ficino, or Poimandres in the Greek Hermetica, was Christ. The Poimander was the embodied Logos and the second person of the Trinity. Just remember to keep in mind that these were potentially heretical and therefore very dangerous statements to make, especially on paper. Henry Cornelius Agrippa even made Hermes the grandson of Abraham to deal with the problem. Anything that was not the patristic genealogy of wisdom was heterodox and highly suspect. Now, for other Renaissance scholars, particularly for Pico della Mirandola, 1463 to 1494, they could not suffer Moses being more recent than Zoroaster or Hermes. Such a thing was preposterous, and Out of this outrage was born the concept of the Christian Kabbalah, which was the idea that Moses had received a perfected form of perfect wisdom directly from God on Sinai, and it was this same wisdom that Christ himself physically embodied and thus understood perfectly without needing to be taught. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, this was language itself, and this cut us off from the one great divine reality. And the tree of life was the re-ascent of the mind back to the contemplation of divine oneness. The problem, obviously, is that Kabbalah is more a medieval Jewish phenomenon, not an ancient Hebrew one. And he's retro-projecting it back into a mythic past. He was claiming, for the first time ever, that we have the root knowledge of Christianity, but that this was kept secret by the Jews, who did not even have a complete understanding of it, and only now that such wisdom was in Christian hands could it be correctly understood. Again, this is his imagination. But Christians now think they can study Kabbalah and use it as a key for unlocking the mysteries of Christianity. Now, along with Kabbalah comes a number of Jewish exegetical practices, and these would be invaluable tools to humanist textual criticism. Now, all this kind of Kabbalistic thinking was critical in the formation of Christian theosophy, as exemplified by the works of Jakob Boehme, or the birth of Rosicrucianism in the early 17th century. There's a great number of things I'd like to say more about this, but unfortunately this talk will be long enough as it is without going down all the avenues. What matters is that, ultimately, the greater circle which encompasses all these lesser circles, Kabbalah, Zoroastrianism, Chaldean magic, Hermeticism, etc., is the concept of Platonic Orientalism. All these traditions are basically dolled up, aesthetically re-envisioned forms of Platonic mysticism, and it's no coincidence that they all start popping up back into popular religious imagination right around the time of Plato's return to Europe. Kabbalah was one way of understanding the message of Platonism, which worked for Jewish sensibilities. Hermeticism for pagan sensibilities, and Zoroastrianism for those with even more hardcore Orientalist sensibilities. But ultimately, they were all just looking at different versions of the same thing. Late antique, mystical, Platonic idealism. Okay, so back to how Hanegraaff defines who and what is a Hermeticist, and why Yates abuses the term. To Hanegraaff, if you don't believe Hermes to be the root of all wisdom, you're apparently not a Hermeticist. This isn't how I define it. I find this definition painfully narrow, but this is his working definition, and that's all that matters for our talk. My problem with this view is that there were texts in circulation before the Renaissance, such as the Picatrix, which have plenty of instances of Hermes or Mercurius, and these instances are strictly within a magical rather than a Gnostic or initiatory context. So, to me, practitioners of the kind of magic contained in the Picatrix are Hermeticists, that is, people who were completely unaware of the Corpus Hermeticum, or Marsilio Ficino, but not so to Hanegraaff. Now, Yates actually talks about the Picatrix in setting up her grand narrative, and it was a key component to priming the world for works like the Poimandres. In any case, I'd love to see how Hanegraaff fits it all into his own narrative. It's possible he's done it somewhere, and I just haven't seen it. Maybe one day, if I'm lucky, I can get him to come on here and we can hash this problem out. But anyhow, if we are going to go along with Hanegraaff's narrow definition, what we'll find is that actual Hermeticists are few and far between. The main thinker who Hanegraaff brings up is Ludovico Lazzarelli, whose works like the Crater Hermetis he translated into English. Ludovico Lazzarelli had rejected the classical tradition after thoroughly having imbibed it via humanist training, and this he did in favor of Christian teachings, but not without a great deal of reconciliation first. He saw in Scripture the same thing, I think, that Augustine saw, a kind of pure, simple, Platonic doctrine that paganism in all its philosophical baroqueness could not encapsulate. Of course, this had to do with the change in people's values from late antiquity onward, but we're not going to go there. Now, in this dialogue, the Crater Hermetis, Lazzarelli imagined himself initiating King Ferdinand I and his court poet or administrator, Giovanni Pontano, into the mysteries of Christian Hermeticism. His radical idea was that, yes, the true wisdom had begun with Hermes, but it was fulfilled or redeemed by Christ. It was part of the grand Christian narrative of salvation, that God had revealed himself first to the pagans, and that he might later redeem the whole world through the seeds that he'd planted. Don't forget, Abraham was a virtuous Chaldean pagan before God revealed himself to him. So, ultimately, there have to be pagans getting credit somewhere along the line. Now, again, Henry Cornelius Agrippa, in his 3 books on occult philosophy, believed in accordance with Lazzarelli that Hermes Trismegistus was the root of all wisdom. I should mention that there is plenty of evidence of Agrippa having had a copy of the Picatrix, but that's another story. He believed that Hermes was the grandson of Abraham as a creative way to yoke everyone together, the Chaldeans, the Hebrews, and the Egyptians, and to fix the problem that Hermes was older than Moses. Agrippa adopted Lazzarelli's view that Christ was Pimander, and he writes in his Oratio Habita Popeye, which was written in 1515, that, quote, "The thrice great Pimander Mercurius, mind of divine power, is our Lord, the crucified Nazarene, Jesus Christ, who is the true Pimander, who, as the messenger of the great council, illuminates our mind with the true light, whom we profess to be truly God and truly man, the Father of regeneration, and whom we expect as the judge of the coming age." Here we're going to fast forward to the 17th century, when all of these similar intellectual currents start taking root at the heart of all kind of heretical and unorthodox movements. Now, during the Counter-Reformation, this idea comes out thanks to the works of all these different Platonic Orientalists, that the author of all heresies is Plato. In fact, there's one idea that is put forth during the Counter-Reformation, and it's a kind of razor that claims that the mother of all abominations, the source of all heresies, was the belief that the world was eternal, rather than a one-off blast of creative energy which came ex nihilo. The eternity of the world implied that human souls were not created, but emanated from God's own essence, such that they have an inborn spark of the divine themselves. As a result of this belief, one does not need to believe on the authority of established traditions or holy scriptures, let alone believe in an external savior or redeemer. No, if we emanated from God, then we can know God directly. Now, this capacity for gnosis was obviously dangerous in that it subverted all of the authority of the Bible and the Church. Now, I think there's something to this idea, especially when you start getting into all sorts of crazy stuff like the Nag Hammadi Library, or much later, Helena Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine. But it also has its issues. Did the Zoroastrians not have their own built-in eschatology? Did the Hermeticists not have their Lament of Hermes? And what about the different factions of Judaism? Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, who all differed in their opinions regarding souls, angels, and life after death. It's not that good of a razor. Now, during the Counter-Reformation, the idea came about that when Christianity was victorious, they should have destroyed Platonism altogether. But instead, it was infected by the Platonic knowledge that it tried to reconcile itself with. When I heard this, the first thing my brain did was rework an old poem of Horace's to say, Plato took captive his savage conqueror and brought his arts into rustic Augustine, paralleling and reiterating the idea that the culture of the Greeks captured its Latin conquerors. Now, the problem with this Catholic Counter-Reformation thought was actually giving ammunition to the 17th century Protestant anti-apologeticists, as they're called, who asked themselves, well, who was it that invited in the virus of Platonic paganism? Obviously, it wasn't us, pure Christians. It was the Catholic Church. It's the Church Fathers who are responsible for the degeneration of Christianity by inviting in Plato. So what good are they to us anyhow? And so from that idea, there were great debates between Protestants and Catholics over the Platonizing influence Christianity had accumulated over top of the pure gospel message. Now, this effectively is where the idea of Western esotericism spawned, as a kind of wastebasket category, or perhaps a more dignified way to put it is as the shadow cast by orthodoxy. That is, what is heterodoxy, that which has to be stuffed away and hidden, but the inversion of orthodoxy? Obviously, people kept thinking about philosophy, theology, and mysticism, but what could not be classified as Orthodox Catholicism, or some various strands of Protestantism, was by nature heterodox, and thus ferreted away. The sum total of these heterodox ideas, then, whether or not they even actually had anything in common with one another other than being rejected by the mainstream, end up in one gigantic category called, quote, Western Esotericism. And deconstructing this concept will be the topic of the second part of this lecture. What I'll say for now is this. Western esotericism is not a concrete thing in and of itself. It is a historiographical concept. And so the great debates I will be exploring in my next lecture are about whether or not it is justifiable to even use such a non-essentialized concept such as esotericism to do history. Historians are supposed to apply historicity, that is, they're supposed to understand historical people on their own terms, using their own language, not with a top-down, superimposed, retro-projected umbrella term which can be hardly defined. We'll unpack this more when we return, getting into the debates as to whether Hanegraaff can truly be called a historian or whether he should be called a discourse theoretician, which I suppose is a kind of literary critic. I'll give you a hint, though. Hanegraaff, like myself, is no great lover of postmodernism, though he's going to be forced to deal with all the criticisms which are levied by it. So, thanks for listening. I'm Dan Attrell, and I will see you next time.